Hey everyone, this is Bobo from the Mari server. I'm here to do a video on a Mabinogi normal dungeons. I know some of you guys are wondering, why are you doing a video on this? Well, ever since the revamp, I don't think too many people know about the changes in the amount of floors, how tanky the mobs are, and whatnot. So let's go ahead and take a look at all these old dungeons and see how they are now. Now, if you guys have been living under a rock, basically we have this new rock right here located near Dunby, and it is basically a thing that you can talk to and it'll take and teleport you to a specific dungeon. Now, it's located right here, like I said, in Dunbarton to the left, so if you guys need to find it, there it is. There's also an NPC standing next to this rock, and if you talk to this guy, he sells you some passes that you guys can use, some basic passes, for the specific dungeons. Now, if you also talk to him, he can also recommend the difficulty for what dungeon your character should do, based off of, I guess, the total or and whatnot. If you're like, oh man, I don't know if I can do that dungeon, you can also click on, is there anything harder or easier? And he'll be like, yeah, how about this? So it's kind of a nice little neat feature, kind of for those people who aren't sure which dungeon they should be doing for their difficulty. Now in this video, I will be covering all 9 dungeons such as Alby, Sierra, Math, Rabi, Vari, Coil, Fjord, Rundle, and Pika. Now they're basically gonna be a timer on the bottom right corner, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's a speed run. It's just a approximate time for you guys to see how long it might take you guys to do the run. It can be longer for those newbies out there, and it might be shorter for those who are extra pros. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so the first dungeon that you guys will most likely do when you first play Mabinogi, it is Alby Dungeon. Alby Dungeon is filled with easy enemies that won't really aggro you, such as the country rats, meek bats, old mimic, white spiders, white spiderlings, young country rats, and of course your giant spider and red spiders as the boss. They're not too hard, but you know, might be for newbies. If you guys know how to fight them, it shouldn't be too difficult. Here is the end reward that you guys might get, a little bit of gold, and some enchant that probably people won't use, but a lot of people spam Alby just to get enchants to train enchanting. The next dungeon is Sierra Dungeon. It is relatively easy, but it's still slightly difficult than Alby because of the fact that there are finally some enemies that might aggro you. And in this dungeon, you guys will find mobs like bats, black spiders, goblin archers, your grey town rats, mimics, poison goblins, red spiders, blue ratman, and of course your boss, the golem, as well as some metal skeletons of his minions. Now this dungeon, as you can see, has been revamped down to 1 floor. It used to have been 3 floors and now it's only 1. But as you can see, they're slightly more tankier. Might still be easy for a lot of pros out there, but still definitely harder for those newbies. As you guys can see in the end chest reward, it's not too crazy as always, stuff that we just don't want. The next dungeon on the list is Math Dungeon, and in Math Dungeon you guys can see that it has been revamped to a lot more shorter in terms of the amount of rooms. Math Dungeon used to have lots and lots of rooms and always just at 1 floor, but now there's less rooms but a lot more tankier mobs. You'll find mobs such as your regular Math Dungeon would have, like the bats, black spiders, giant skeletons, grey town rats, kobolds, kobold archers, mimics, pocket mouse aka Pikachu, poison kobolds, and red spiders, and of course your boss is still the hellhounds, 3 of them to be exact. They're quite tanky, just like any other revamp that they have for this dungeon, so be very, very careful. You might not be able to one-shot them this time. Now here is how they look like. Yeah, still the same. They don't seem too threatening, but they're still quite tanky. And chest reward is same thing as usual, a pile of gold and some random stuff. I still think they need to work on the reward system, but that's what you guys get. Now the next dungeon is basically Rabi Dungeon. It's neighboring dungeon from Math. Rabi Dungeon, I can't really say too much has been revamped here besides the fact that now it is 2 floors, and I'm pretty sure it was 3 floors before, and the enemies are again tankier as usual. Here in this dungeon you guys will find your typical Rabi Dungeon mobs such as the bats, grey town rats, mimics, skeleton wolf, skeletons, red skeletons, metal skeletons, Rarely the mini light armored versions of the skeletons and the heavy armored versions of the skeletons. And again, rarely the red skeletons that are minis. And of course, if you solo this run, you'll run into the Black Succubus. But if you do a party run, you'll run into a wave of a goblin. And then the second wave will be gold goblins with goblin archers. So that's basically Rabi in a nutshell. It's kind of difficult in a sense that they kind of made them a little bit more tankier, but it's very convenient that it's only 2 floors long now. You don't have to go through 3 floors instead. So that is basically a dungeon for you. If you guys want to take a look at the kind of reward you guys might get, here it is. What is it? Junk. I'm telling you guys, the reward in Rabi is not really that great. It's just a pile of little gold and then some other diddly blobs you guys don't want. Now the next dungeon on the list is a dungeon I remember was very scary to do after it first got released, and I think it's because it was the very first time we had an enemy boss that would ping on our attacks. So here it is again, guys, in memory of Rabi Dungeon. Rabi Dungeon is now 2 floors long. It's got 5 ogres, one of them extremely large, and in this run you guys will still see your typical Rabi Dungeon stuff, such as like things that you guys can mine for ores, as well as your enemies in Rabi are just the same. The enemies that you guys might encounter in Rabi normal is Banner Imp, Black Spider, Goblin, Goblin Archers, Great Mimic, Imp, Mimic, Poison Goblin, Red Spider, Vampire Bat, and of course the Ogre Warriors. To be honest, I feel like this dungeon is super easy, but it is quite hard in terms of fighting the boss. Everything else is super easy. I feel like there's barely anything or much that will aggro you in this run, except for the archers. I don't think people like archers in the beginning of their Rabi years and times playing. I think archers were probably the most annoying ones to fight, especially the poison ones. One thing I like about Rabi is the design that they have for this dungeon. It's got a nice underground mine look to it, and it makes it feel like, yeah, you're really fighting in a completely different area. Now for those who want to see the boss, here it is. The bosses, it seems easy to fight. As you can see, I killed them off pretty quick, but back in the days, oh my goodness, they're very difficult. People kind of have to firebolt spam them just to kill them off. Now here is the reward that you guys can get. It's again your typical box of random gold and some items that people don't really want. Again, they really do need to work on the reward system, but other than that, it is your typical rewards. Next dungeon is Coil Dungeon. Coil Dungeon, not really my favorite dungeon, but it exists for a reason. Now this dungeon has about 2 floors to it, and it's and kind of an outdoorsy look to it as well. In this dungeon, you guys can find quite a lot of enemies, such as the Mimic, Grey Town Rats, Brown Snakes, Blue Snakes, White Snakes, Ice Sprites, Fire Sprites, Lightning Sprites, Red Spider, Black Spider, Werewolves, Jackals, Red Grizzly Bears, Gorgon, Invisible Imps, Green Gremlins, and Imp. The boss is a giant Fire Sprite and a giant Headless. So, I personally think that this dungeon is kind of a difficult dungeon because of the sprites. The sprites are kind of hard for newer players. They ping a lot, they do a lot of magic attack, they can be quite annoying. I honestly don't remember how long Coil used to have been, but it does seem like the dungeon has gotten relatively shorter. It only is 2 floors. You can see that the rooms aren't too many, but the enemies, as always, are quite tanky. And the tankier they are, the harder it is to kill them. I remember these Gorgons were really scary, so I can't imagine how it is for newer players. Coil Dungeon, to be honest, is not really a popular dungeon, but it is a dungeon existent in the game because of, in my opinion, the sprites, as well as the Headless. I think some people will need to kill this enemy for a specific reason, like, you know, pages and whatnot. And it's kind of a big pain, as you can see. It was difficult, even for me, just to kill it off at my level. So you can see that they really tanked up the dungeon and the bosses in this run. Now here's the rewards you guys can get. Again, a pile of gold and some you know, enchanted stuff. Nobody really wants. But yeah, it's always a thing in terms of rewards for dungeons in Mabi. Alright, and now on to the next dungeon. The next dungeon is Coil Dungeon. It is not really, again, my favorite dungeons. I'm not really a big fan of outdoor dungeons because in the nighttime, they're very difficult to see. So yeah, that is one thing you guys have to keep in mind when you guys are doing these kind of dungeons. In this dungeon, you guys will see your typical mobs such as the black spiders, brown snake, blue snake, gray town rat, green gremlin, Gordon, jackal, mimic, red bear, red grizzly bear cub, red spider, werewolf, white snake, wisp, and the boss is basically a small golem that's white, but not really white. It's called a white, I don't know. And a flying sword, or several flying swords actually. This dungeon is pretty much 3 floors long, and in my opinion, I just don't think that it got any shorter. This dungeon seems to be pretty long as always, but probably the amount of rooms have shortened. I can't really tell, but it's still definitely tankier. The mobs, in my opinion, are not too bad to fight. I felt that there would have been more mobs in the past, like now there's less, I can't tell. Maybe it's just me. But that's basically Coil Dungeon. All of this is all an example of Coil Dungeon. I know it's really hard to see because of the lighting. I've been basically fighting this dungeon in the dark. Hard to see all the chests. I had to go back a couple times. It was like really annoying. Not really my choice of dungeon to do. Honestly, don't know why people would even do Coil Dungeon. But, you know, if you guys need to kill the golem, I guess? So, here is the boss. I can't even see the boss, but there it is. It's pretty tanky, guys. It's a little bit tankier than what I remember. I mean, for Coil, I usually assume I can just one-shot it, but now it's kind of like, oh god, it's still attacking me. It's still alive. And the great thing about Coil Dungeon is now, starting at this dungeon, all the gold comes in gold bags. Yeah, it's not a spillage of gold all over the floor anymore. They now put it in gold bags. And I think it's actually for any dungeon that has quite a lot of gold to give at the end chest reward. Alright, now going on to the next dungeon, and it is one of my favorite dungeons. It is Rundle Dungeon. If I had to choose a dungeon in Mabi, this is probably the one dungeon I like the most, just because of the fact that it's very, very nice looking. It's very bright. You can clearly see where things are. You won't get lost. You can kind of even see in advance where the rooms might be. So it's really a really nice dungeon to fight in. In this dungeon, you guys will run into enemies such as the pirate skeleton hook, pirate skeleton, skeleton wolf, flying sword, gray town rats, treasure mimic, red spider, black spiders, and of course the cyclops as your boss. And now, if I had to say what has been revamped in this run, I can't remember. I'm sorry guys, but I feel like Rundle had used to been 5 floors or 4, something ridiculous, and now it is down to 3. So if that was the case, then it got shorter for sure. But definitely one thing that they did change was the tankiness of the enemies. Like every single dungeon, these enemies are a lot more tankier. I mean, skeleton is tanky. I mean, like usually they just take one shot, and now it's like, oh my goodness, they're surviving my hits. So you can see that the enemies are a little bit more harder and definitely more annoying, but it's not so bad. It's not so difficult, in my opinion. Decent run to do if you guys are looking for some EXP. So yeah, that is basically Rundle for you. Now one thing you guys might want to keep in mind is the fact that the boss did get beefed up. Just like any other revamped dungeon, the bosses are all tankier. The bosses can be so tanky that it just kind of throws you off guard if you haven't been playing Mabi in a while. I remember I was fighting the boss and I was like, huh? You're not dead? So just keep that in mind. If you're fighting the boss, it is definitely tankier. It will require many more hits than before. I mean, I can definitely understand the reason why they've done this, because there are a lot more new skills now in Mabi that makes it easier to do a lot of damage. So they've got to kind of balance it in a way where it's not so easy to do dungeons, otherwise there's no reason to. But to be honest, there is still no reason to because the dungeon rewards suck. Alright, finally, last but not least, Pika Dungeon. The very hardest, supposedly, dungeon for normal difficulty in the game. Pika Dungeon is 3 floors long. I'm pretty sure it was 5 floors at some point, but now it is 3 floors long, and you don't need to have a party of 4 to enter. Yes, that used to have been a thing, where Pika would literally refuse you to enter the dungeon unless you had a minimum of 4 players. Now it's like, well, you're kinda strong, so maybe you can solo it. So now they let anybody in who is just one person in the party. So that's one thing to kind of see that has changed in terms of the revamp. Now, to be honest, I was a little bit worried to do Pika Dungeon because I remember back in the days it was one of the most difficult dungeons to do, and it took a long time to do this dungeon. You'd have people saying like, let's all drop in 1 gold and do Pika together because it was that hard. We needed more than a party of 8. And honestly, right now, it is actually very easy, at least for my level. I'm not sure about the lower levels out there, but it is a relatively okay dungeon to do, especially with all the new skills out right now. So as you guys can see, I kind of tunnel through the dungeon decently. It is still a relatively long dungeon to solo for a high level character. So just keep that in mind, guys. It's not something that you can just get done. It is one of the longest dungeons still to do in the game. Now, the kind of enemies that you guys can find in Pika Dungeon is basically the ghouls that are gray, the ghouls that are blue, the whites, the coffin mimics, the treasure mimics, cloaker, red ghosts, blue ghosts, vampire bats, hollow knights, and of course the boss being the demi-lich with a black ship rat and some ghosts. Now, if I had to say one thing I like about Pika, the Pika Dungeon is basically a dungeon where you cannot just focus on one type of skill set. There are some enemies that are immune to melee, and there are some that are immune to magic, so they force you to switch between different skills. Definitely a good dungeon just for that purpose. The boss itself will also require you to kill it with a ghost sword, otherwise any damage dealt to it will only take 1. And you can get all the materials for the ghost sword by killing the enemies in the boss room. So that's kind of a nice little thing to it. Now here's the end chest reward, guys. Basically, same stuff. And that is my video on Mabinogi normal dungeons. If I forgot anything, feel free to leave them in the comments below and help each other out. Thanks you guys for watching my video, and like always guys, please stay awesome.